Throw her out before breakfast, the Duke said to his butler. By breakfast he had proposed. The door to room 14 swung open, and Clara Whitmore walked straight into the wrong life. She did not know it yet. She had a candle in one hand, a small leather bag in the other, and the kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones after 14 hours on a train from Edinburgh. The room was dark. The bed was large. The sheets were turned down with the precision that spoke of servants who had been doing this for 40 years and had never once done it wrong. Clara set her bag on the chair near the window, kicked off her boots, and was asleep before the candle burned down to its last inch. She did not hear the clock in the hall strike 2. She did not hear the front door of Aldermere House open and close. She did not hear the footsteps on the marble stairs, measured and unhurried, because the man who climbed them had learned long ago that running solved very little, and that rushing was a habit for people who did not plan well enough. William Cavendish Stour, the 5th Duke of Westhaven, came home at 2 in the morning from a dinner at his club that had gone on longer than he intended. He was 41 years old. He had grey at his temples and a way of looking at a room that made other people feel they were being assessed for structural soundness. He did not smile easily, but when he did, it was the kind of smile that made people feel they had earned something rare. He handed his coat to Pemberton, his butler, who had been awake since 6 that morning, and would have stood at that door until 6 the next if that was what was required of him. "Is everything in order?" the Duke asked. "Yes, Your Grace," Pemberton said, which was the answer he always gave because it was almost always true, and on the occasions when it was not, Pemberton had already fixed the problem before being asked. The Duke went upstairs. He turned the handle of his bedroom door. He stepped inside. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a candle stub on the nightstand. There was a shape in his bed. There was a bag on his chair. There were 2 small boots on the floor near the window, placed side by side with a neatness that suggested their owner was a tidy person who nonetheless had not entirely thought through the situation she was creating. The Duke stood very still for a moment. He was not a man who startled easily. He had once stood on a ship's deck during a storm off the coast of Portugal without holding on to anything, simply because he had decided he was not going to fall and the storm had apparently agreed with his assessment. But this was different. This was a person, in his bed, in his house, a person he had never seen before who appeared to be sleeping with considerable contentment in a room she had no right to be in. He walked back to the door. He called for Pemberton in the quiet, even voice of a man who is controlling something. Pemberton appeared at the top of the stairs within 30 seconds. He had been a butler long enough to know that the Duke calling his name in that particular tone meant that something had happened which was not covered by the usual running of the house. "There is a woman in my room," the Duke said. Pemberton looked at the door. He looked at the Duke. He said nothing for a moment, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing he had ever done. "A woman, Your Grace." "In my bed, Pemberton." "I see. Do you know how she came to be there?" "I will find out immediately." What Pemberton found out over the next 20 minutes involved a conversation with the night footman, a consultation with the house ledger, a brief and hushed discussion with the housekeeper who had been roused from sleep and was not especially pleased about it, and the discovery of a booking note that had been written in haste and read with less care than it deserved. The Countess of Elborn had sent her companion ahead to London, with instructions to take the guest room reserved in her name at Aldermere House. The Countess visited frequently enough that she kept a standing arrangement, and the housekeeper, who was new to the position by only 4 months, had made an error that a more experienced person would not have made. The Countess's usual room was the blue room on the 2nd floor. The Duke's room was also on the 2nd floor. The housekeeper had sent Clara Whitmore to the wrong door. Pemberton brought this information to the Duke, who was sitting in the armchair in his study with a glass of brandy he had not touched. "She is the Countess's companion," Pemberton said. "The Countess of Elborn." "Yes, Your Grace. Lady Elborn sent her ahead. The housekeeper placed her in your room by mistake." The Duke looked at the fire. He set the untouched brandy down on the side table. "What is her name?" "Miss Clara Whitmore, Your Grace." "Is she the sort of person who will cause a scene when she is moved?" "I cannot say, Your Grace. I have not spoken with her." "She appeared to be sleeping very soundly." "Yes, Your Grace." "It seems a shame," the Duke said, and then he stopped, because what he was about to say was that it seemed a shame to wake someone who was sleeping that deeply after a long journey, which was a thought entirely out of character for a man who had rules about his house and kept them without exception. He picked up the brandy. "Leave her until morning," he said. "There are other rooms." Pemberton said nothing, because there was nothing appropriate to say. But he noted, in the part of his mind where he kept the small observations that had never once been wrong in 19 years of service, that the Duke had just done something he had never done before. He had inconvenienced himself. For a stranger who had walked into his house and gone to sleep in his bed. The Duke spent the night in the East Room, which had a mattress that was not quite as good and a window that faced the wrong direction, and he slept badly, which had nothing to do with the mattress. Clara Whitmore woke at 7:30. She lay still for a moment in the way that people do when they are in an unfamiliar place, and they are trying, before they open their eyes, to remember where they are and how they came to be there. The ceiling, when she looked at it, was higher than the ceiling at the Countess's townhouse in Edinburgh. The plasterwork was more elaborate. The room was larger. She sat up. She looked around at the heavy curtains, the dark wood furniture, the books on the small shelf near the fireplace, and the general atmosphere of a room that belonged to someone specific and had been arranged precisely to suit them. This was not the Blue Room. She knew the Blue Room. She had stayed in it twice before, when the Countess had brought her along to London, and there had been nowhere else for a companion to sleep except under the same roof as her employer. The Blue Room had light curtains and a flowered rug and a painting of the sea above the mantel. This room had none of those things. This room had a painting of a horse. Clara stood up from the bed. She went to the window and looked out at the street below, and then she turned around and looked at the room again, and a feeling that was somewhat below dread and somewhat above mild concern began to settle around her shoulders like a coat put on in the wrong season. She found her boots, she put them on, she fastened them with the care of a person who is buying time to think. She smoothed the bed with both hands, which was an instinct rather than a plan. She picked up her bag. She opened the bedroom door. Pemberton was standing in the corridor. Not waiting exactly. Pemberton never looked as though he was waiting. He looked as though he simply happened to be precisely where he was, and had always been there, and would continue to be there for as long as it was appropriate. "Good morning, miss," he said. "Good morning," Clara said. "I believe I may be in the wrong room." "Yes, miss. I am sorry about that." "There is no need to apologize, miss. It was an error made by the household." Clara looked at him steadily. She had grown up in a family with very little money and a great deal of dignity, and she had learned early that the way to manage an embarrassing situation was to look at it directly and not pretend it was something else. "Whose room is it?" she asked. Pemberton paused for a fraction of a second that was so small only someone paying very close attention would have noticed it. "His Grace the Duke of Westhaven's, miss." Clara absorbed this. "And where did the Duke sleep?" "His Grace made other arrangements, miss." "In his own house?" "Yes, miss." Clara set her bag down on the floor of the corridor. She straightened her back. She had a spine that had always been perfectly upright, not from arrogance but from the habit of a woman who had spent years trying to take up less space in other people's houses, and had eventually decided that was not a reasonable way to live. "I would like to apologize to him," she said. "That will not be necessary, miss." "It is necessary to me." Pemberton considered this. In 19 years, very few people had asked to seek out the Duke for the purpose of apologizing to him. Most people who encountered the Duke were either trying to impress him or trying to avoid annoying him, and in Clara Whitmore, Pemberton was looking at someone who appeared to be doing neither. "His Grace is at breakfast," Pemberton said after a moment. "Then I will apologize at breakfast," Clara said. She picked up her bag. The breakfast room at Aldermere House was a long room with tall windows that let in the morning light in sheets. The Duke was at the far end of the table, which was set as it always was set, with the morning papers on his left and his coffee on his right and the eggs precisely in the middle, and everything in its correct place in a way that suggested the table had been prepared by people who understood that order was not a preference but a standard. He looked up when she came in. Clara Whitmore was not a tall woman, but she walked as though she had decided some years ago that height was not the most important thing about a person and had moved on. She had dark hair that she wore plainly, and she had the kind of face that did not announce itself at first glance, but that people found themselves looking at again a few minutes later, wondering what they had almost missed. She stopped at the end of the table at a respectful distance. "Your Grace," she said, "I am Clara Whitmore. I am companion to the Countess of Elborn. I slept in your room last night by mistake, and I want to apologize for the disruption it caused you." The Duke looked at her. Most people, when the Duke looked at them with that particular quality of attention, felt the need to keep talking. Clara did not. She had said what she came to say, and she waited. "You were sent to the wrong room," the Duke said. "I was, but I should have confirmed it before settling in. I did not, that was careless." "You were tired." "Yes, that is an explanation, not an excuse." The Duke said nothing for a moment. He had conducted hundreds of conversations in this room, with politicians and merchants and diplomats and relations who wanted things from him, and not one of them had ever said anything quite like that. "Sit down," he said. Clara looked at him. "You have not eaten," he said. "I was going to ask Pemberton to direct me to the Countess's room." "The Countess is not here yet. She is expected this afternoon. Sit down and have breakfast." It was not a warm invitation. It was not quite a command. It was the statement of a man who had decided something and saw no reason why the world would arrange itself differently. Clara sat down. Pemberton appeared with a second cup, with the smoothness of a man who had already anticipated this outcome, and the coffee was poured, and the eggs were offered, and for a few minutes there was only the sound of cutlery and the morning papers and the street outside. "How long have you been in the Countess's service?" the Duke asked, without looking up from the paper. 3 years, Clara said. "She is my godmother." "I know. She has never mentioned a companion." "She has mentioned you a great deal," Clara said. The Duke looked up. "Has she?" "Mostly to say that you are exactly like your father in the ways that are useful, and nothing like him in the ways that are not." It was, under any formal measure of what a companion should say to a duke she had met 3 minutes ago over a breakfast she had not been invited to, a very bold thing to say. Clara was aware of this. She said it anyway because it was true, and because she had a fundamental difficulty leaving true things unsaid when they seemed relevant. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. "My father," he said, "was an excellent manager of estates and a poor manager of people." The Countess said something very similar. She would know. He went back to his paper. Clara ate her eggs. It was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the stranger breakfasts that had ever been eaten in that room. But it was not unpleasant. It had a quality that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and neither of them was ready for that. When she set down her fork, she looked out the window at the street below and thought that London in October had a particular kind of grey light that Edinburgh never quite managed, and that it suited the city in the way that certain colors suit certain people, not because they are soft but because they are honest. "Thank you for breakfast," she said. The Duke nodded without looking up. Clara pushed back her chair, picked up her bag from where she had set it by the door, and went to find Pemberton and ask about the Blue Room. She did not look back. She did not need to look back to know that the Duke had set down his paper. She simply knew it, the way a person sometimes knows that the air in a room has changed, even when they cannot say exactly when or why. The Countess of Elborn arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon in a carriage that was slightly too large for the London streets and a mood that was entirely too large for a carriage. She was 63 years old, and she had the energy of someone half her age and the opinions of someone who had been collecting them for twice as long as she had actually lived. She came through the front door of Aldermere House as though she had built it herself and was inspecting the workmanship. "William," she said, when the Duke appeared in the hall. "Lady Elborn," he said. "Do not Lady Elborn me. I am your godmother and you have been avoiding my letters." "I have been answering your letters." "You have been responding to my letters, which is a different thing entirely. Answering implies that you said something. Where is Clara?" "Miss Whitmore is in the Blue Room." "Good, she looked tired when she left Edinburgh. She works too hard." "I keep telling her she works too hard and she keeps doing it anyway." The Countess handed her coat to Pemberton without looking at him because she knew he was there. She had known Pemberton almost as long as the Duke had, Has she been comfortable? She slept in my room last night, the Duke said. The Countess stopped walking. She turned around very slowly and looked at her godson with the particular expression she had been developing since he was 8 years old, which combined genuine affection with the strong suspicion that he was about to tell her something that was going to require effort. I beg your pardon. There was an error with the rooms. She was shown to my room by mistake. She arrived late and was not to blame. And where did you sleep? The East room. The Countess looked at him for a long moment. You gave up your room. The alternative was waking her. She had come from Edinburgh. Yes, the Countess said slowly. I know where she came from. She works for me. She studied him with the focus of a woman who had spent 60 years reading people and had not yet lost the habit. You did not wake her. No. William, you have had guests thrown out of this house for being in the wrong room. That was different. How was it different? The Duke looked at her in the measured way that meant he was not going to answer that particular question. The Countess said nothing more about it. But she walked upstairs to find Clara with the brisk step of a woman who had just become very interested in something, and Pemberton, who was still holding her coat, watched her go with the expression of a man who had seen the shape of things and was quietly rearranging his expectations for the next few days. Clara was sitting at the small desk in the blue room, writing a letter to her sister in Bristol, when the Countess came in without knocking, which was a habit the Countess had and which Clara had long since stopped minding. How are you? The Countess asked, sitting down on the edge of the bed with the authority of a woman in her own house, which Aldermere House was not technically, but the Countess had never allowed technicalities to govern her behavior. Very well, thank you, Clara said. You slept in the Duke's room. Clara set down her pen. I did. It was an error with the rooms. I apologized to him this morning. And he invited me to breakfast. The Countess looked at her with very bright eyes. Did he? He was perfectly civil. William is always perfectly civil. He is civil the way a wall is civil. It is there, it is solid, it keeps the weather out, but you cannot have a conversation with it. She paused. What did you talk about? His father, Clara said, and then immediately wondered why she had said that, because it was the kind of answer that made simple things sound complicated. The Countess was quiet for a moment. His father, she repeated. I mentioned what you had said. I should not have. It was forward of me. What did he say? He agreed with you. The Countess stood up from the bed and smoothed her skirts with both hands, which was something she did when she was thinking and did not want anyone to know she was thinking. I see, she said. It was only breakfast, Clara said. Of course it was, the Countess said. Everything is only something until it is something else. She went to the door and then stopped with her hand on the frame. His Grace has agreed to let us stay through the week as my house is being painted. I hope that is not inconvenient. Not at all, Clara said. Good. The Countess looked at her in the warm, slightly dangerous way she had when she was pleased about something she had not done yet. I am glad you are here, Clara. I have a feeling this week is going to be interesting. Clara looked at her employer for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her letter. Outside the window, London was doing what London always did in October, which was getting dark earlier than anyone was ready for, and the lights in the houses on the street below were coming on one by one, warm and particular, each one a different version of ordinary life going on inside. She wrote to her sister about the train journey, and the city, and the fact that the trees in the square outside had turned a very good color. She did not write about the breakfast. She was not sure yet what she would have said. The butler's name was Pemberton, and he had a rule about opinions. He did not share them. In 19 years of service to the Duke of Westhaven, Pemberton had watched the arrival and departure of hundreds of guests, the management of 3 major estates, 2 lawsuits, 1 flood, and 4 attempts by various relations to borrow money under circumstances that could charitably be described as optimistic. He had formed opinions about all of it. He had shared none of them. This morning he was struggling. He stood in the kitchen of Aldermere House at 6:30, speaking with Mrs. Granger, the housekeeper, who had not yet forgiven herself for the error with the rooms, and was dealing with this through the medium of reorganizing every cabinet in the kitchen in a way that suggested the cabinets were responsible for her mistake. His Grace said nothing more about it, Mrs. Granger asked. Nothing, Pemberton said. He is not angry. His Grace expressed no anger. Pemberton, Mrs. Granger turned from the cabinet and looked at him with the directness of a woman who had run large households for 20 years and had no time for careful language at 6 in the morning. Is he angry or is he not angry? He is, Pemberton said, picking his words with the precision of a watchmaker, not in the mood he typically occupies after a disruption. Mrs. Granger looked at him. He is in a better mood, she said. He is in a different mood, Pemberton said. I would not go as far as better. This was not entirely true, and Pemberton was aware of it, which was why he qualified it. The Duke had come down to breakfast that morning at his usual time, had eaten his usual breakfast, had read his papers, and had done all of this with the surface appearance of a man going through his ordinary Tuesday. But Pemberton had brought coffee to this man every morning for 19 years. He knew the shape of the Duke's ordinary Tuesday, and this was not quite it. The Duke had asked, while reaching for his second piece of toast, what time Miss Whitmore usually rose in the morning. He had asked it in the tone of a man asking about the weather. He had not looked up from the paper. He had accepted the answer, which was that Pemberton did not know. Without further comment, he had eaten his toast. He had gone to his study. But he had asked. William Cavendish Store did not ask questions about guests. He tolerated them, occasionally engaged with them at dinner, and then they left, and the house returned to its correct arrangement, and the Duke returned to his correct mood, and everyone was satisfied. He had never in 19 years asked what time a guest rose in the morning. Pemberton drank his tea. Everything is to proceed as normal, he told Mrs. Granger. The Countess and Miss Whitmore are to be made comfortable, that is all. And the rooms. Miss Whitmore is in the blue room. She will remain there. Mrs. Granger nodded and went back to the cabinets. Pemberton finished his tea and went to attend to the Morning Post. He did not share his opinion, but he noted it. At 11 o'clock, the Duke was in his study when he heard something in the corridor outside that he could not immediately identify. It was not quite a crash. It was the sound of several objects meeting the floor at once, followed by a moment of silence, followed by a word that a lady's companion who had been raised with care and propriety probably should not have said in a Duke's corridor. He opened the study door. Clara Whitmore was on her knees in the corridor, collecting a scatter of letters, papers, and a small traveling inkwell that had fortunately been sealed, and had therefore not done the damage it might have done to the carpet. Her bag had split at the strap, which was how the contents had met the floor, and she was gathering them with the quick efficiency of someone who was embarrassed, but was not going to be defeated by embarrassment. Miss Whitmore, the Duke said. I am sorry for the noise, she said without looking up. The strap gave way, I have it. He looked at her on the floor of his corridor, gathering her papers with careful hands, and he experienced the brief internal sensation of a man who intends to go back into his study, and instead finds himself crouching down on the carpet to pick up an escaped letter. He held it out to her. She looked up. They were, for a moment, very close together, in the way that happened when two people were both on the floor of a corridor and neither of them had planned it. Thank you, she said. She took the letter. Her fingers did not quite touch his hand. It was a near thing. The strap can be repaired, the Duke said, standing. He examined the bag with the brief, diagnostic attention he gave to anything that had broken. Pemberton knows a man in Marylebone who does good work with leather. That is very kind, Clara said, standing as well and settling the gathered papers back into the bag with the broken strap held closed with her other hand. I can manage it myself. It is a 10-minute errand. I did not come to London to create errands for your household. You also did not come to London to sleep in my bedroom, and yet here we are on the second morning. It was the closest thing to a joke that William Cavendish Store had made in front of another person in a considerable length of time. He was slightly surprised to find he had made it. Clara looked at him. She had, he noticed, the kind of eyes that were thinking something, not the kind that were simply looking, but the kind that were actively engaged in an opinion about what they saw. It was a quality he found less irritating than he would have expected. Here we are, she agreed. Where were you going? To post a letter. To my sister in Bristol. Pemberton can send it. I prefer to walk. He looked at her. It is threatening rain, he said. I have an umbrella. Not at the moment you don't, he said, because she was holding her broken bag shut with the hand that would have carried an umbrella, and the umbrella was presumably still in her room. Clara looked at her occupied hand. She looked at the Duke. Something moved very briefly across her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That is a fair point, she said. Pemberton will send the letter. He sends the post every morning at 11. She considered this. In Clara Whitmore's experience, accepting things from people who had more than she did was a thing to be done carefully, because things given freely often became the basis for expectations later. But this was a letter, and it was threatening rain, and the strap on her bag was broken. Thank you, she said. She handed him the letter. He looked at it for a moment, which was a thing he did not need to do since he was about to give it to Pemberton. But it was addressed in a clear, neat hand to a Miss Helen Whitmore in Bristol, and the address had the look of a letter that had been written to many times. You are close to your sister, he said. She is the only family I have left. He nodded. He did not ask more. He handed the letter back and said he would tell Pemberton, and he went back into his study, and the door closed. Clara stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to find Pemberton herself, because she wanted to be sure the letter went that morning, and because she was the kind of person who preferred to arrange her own affairs when she could. The Duke had a correspondence that needed attending. He sat at his desk and attended to it for approximately 20 minutes before he realized he had written the same line 3 times and had not noticed until the 3rd time through. He put down his pen. He stood up and went to the window that looked over the garden, which was doing the thing that London gardens did in October, which was holding onto the last of itself before the cold came and took the rest. He thought about the letter. It was not an interesting thought. It was simply that she had one sister and had phrased the loss of everyone else in very plain language, the way people did when they had made their peace with it but still knew exactly where the absence was. He recognized that quality. He had it himself. His father, his mother, an older brother who had died before William was old enough to remember him properly. The kind of family that was smaller than it was supposed to be, for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's choices. He went back to his desk. He wrote his correspondence, and this time it went faster because thinking about something else first sometimes cleared the way. At 1:45, Pemberton knocked and entered. The Countess is asking if your Grace will join them for luncheon, Pemberton said, in the small dining room. The Duke looked up. Them, he said. The Countess and Miss Whitmore, your Grace. He should have said no. He had work in the afternoon, and luncheon took time, and the small dining room meant a conversation rather than a meal, because it was the sort of room that made conversations happen whether you intended them or not. Tell the Countess yes, he said. Pemberton did not change his expression. Yes, your Grace, he said. The small dining room was, in fact, not especially small. It was smaller than the formal dining room, which could seat 30 people, and was used on occasions that required a room capable of impressing the kind of guest who was susceptible to being impressed by rooms. The small dining room seated 8 and had a fire and windows that looked onto the garden, and it was the room that the Duke actually liked, which was why he used it rarely, because he had a long-standing habit of preserving the things he liked from overuse. The Countess was already at the table when he arrived, wearing an expression of innocent pleasure that he recognized from 30 years of being her godson. It was the expression she wore when she was pleased with something she had arranged. Clara was standing at the window, looking at the garden. She turned when he came in. Your Grace, she said. Miss Whitmore, he pulled out his chair. How is the room? Very comfortable, thank you. The Countess watched this exchange with the bright, alert attention of someone watching a play she had written. I have been telling Clara about the time you fell into the fountain at Beaumont House, the Countess said, settling her napkin in her lap. I did not fall, the Duke said. I stepped. You stepped directly into a fountain that was running at full capacity because you were reading a dispatch and not watching where you were going. The distinction between stepping and falling seems academic. The dispatch was important. You were 12. Clara, who had sat down across from him, did not laugh. She had the restrained expression of a person exercising some effort not to. "What was the dispatch?" she asked. He looked at her. People did not usually ask that. They usually settled for the image of the 12-year-old in the fountain. "A report on crop yields from the Westhaven estate in Derbyshire," he said. "There had been a dry summer. I wanted to know the numbers before my father asked me about them." "You were 12, she said, "and you were worried about crop yields." "My father was the kind of man who asked about crop yields at dinner," he said. "Preparation was advisable." There was a brief pause. "My father," Clara said, "asked about bridge construction at dinner, so I understand preparation." The Countess looked between them. "How interesting," she said, in the tone of someone who found it very interesting indeed, and then applied herself to her soup in a way that suggested she was done directing the scene and was happy to watch it manage itself. In the afternoon the Duke had meetings. 3 of them, one after another in his study, with a solicitor and then an estate manager, and then a man from the city whose name the Duke could never quite remember and who could never quite meet the Duke's eye, which was a habit the Duke found both irritating and revealing. Clara spent the afternoon in the library. She had asked Pemberton whether there was a library, and Pemberton had said there was, and had shown her to it with the professional neutrality of a man who was privately glad she had asked, because it meant she was the kind of person who looked for libraries. It was a good library, not a decorative library, which was the kind that had books arranged by color and was designed to be looked at rather than read. It was a working library, which meant the books were in the places where they had been left after being used, and some of them had marks in the margins, and some of them had slips of paper between the pages holding the place of someone who had stopped in the middle and meant to come back. Clara found a book on the history of bridge engineering. She took it to the chair by the window. She read for 3 hours without moving, which was one of the very few things she did that was genuinely effortless. She was on page 94 when the door opened and the Duke came in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. "I am sorry," she said. "Pemberton said the library was available." "It is," he said. He walked to the far bookshelf and ran his finger along the spines with the ease of a man who knew exactly where everything was. "It is always available." He pulled out a volume and turned. He looked at what she was reading. "Bridge engineering," he said. "Yes." He came a few steps closer, not intrusively but enough to read the title properly. "Brunel," he said. "Chapter on the Royal Albert Bridge. My father was an engineer. He worked on bridges his whole career. He used to talk about this bridge in particular as though it were a person he admired." She looked down at the page. "He died before I understood enough to ask him the right questions. I have been trying to learn what I should have asked." The Duke stood very still for a moment with the book in his hand. "How long ago?" he said. 4 years. He nodded. He went to the chair on the other side of the fireplace, which was not so close as to intrude and not so far as to suggest he was leaving, and he sat down and opened his own book. They read in the same room for an hour and a half. Neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that required 2 people who were both all right inside their own heads, and it turned out they were both all right inside their own heads, which was not a given thing for anyone, and was quite rare for 2 people to be at the same time in the same room. When the light from the window began to fail, Clara put in a slip of paper to hold her place. "Thank you," she said, which was for the library and possibly for other things she did not specify. "There is a chapter on the Clifton Bridge as well," the Duke said without looking up. "Later in the book, your father would have known that one." Clara picked up the book and looked at the table of contents. He was right. She put the book under her arm and went to change for dinner. In the library, the Duke read for another 20 minutes without turning a page. The Countess of Elborn had not reached the age of 63 without understanding the difference between a thing that was happening and a thing that had already happened, and simply had not been announced yet. She understood it the way she understood the weather, which was to say that she did not need to look out the window to know it was raining. She could feel it in the quality of the air, in the way the fire behaved, in the small adjustments people made to their behavior when the world outside had changed, and they were quietly adapting. On the 3rd morning at Aldermere House, She sat at breakfast across from her godson and watched him butter his toast. He buttered the toast the same way he always buttered toast, which was with the precision of a man who believed that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly even if the thing was toast. This had not changed, but the angle of his attention had changed, which was to say that when footsteps crossed the hall outside the breakfast room, he noticed them. He did not look up. He noticed them. This was not a thing she had ever seen him do before. William Cavendish Store paid attention to things on purpose and by choice and not by reflex, and she had spent 30 years watching him refuse to pay attention to things that other people could not stop paying attention to. Footsteps in a hall had never once made his head lift toward the door. They were Clara's footsteps, as it happened, which the Countess knew because she had been listening to Clara walk since Edinburgh, and Clara had a particular way of moving that was purposeful without being heavy, which was not a common combination. The footsteps passed the breakfast room and went toward the library. The Duke set down his toast. "She rises early," he said, in the tone of a man making an observation about the weather. "She always has," the Countess said. "She was already at her desk when I woke at 6 this morning. She works more than is good for her." "What does she work on?" "Correspondence for me, organization of my papers. She has been helping me with the archive of my late husband's letters, which is a task that requires someone who can read his handwriting and is not discouraged by disorder. Clara is not discouraged by anything, which I find restful." The Duke looked at his coffee. "Has she no family to go to?" he said, "beyond the sister?" "Her sister is married in Bristol and has 4 children and a small house. There is no room. Clara would not impose in any case." The Countess sipped her tea. "She is the kind of person who makes herself useful wherever she is, which means she is very good at her work and in some danger of never being anything else." She said this clearly, and watched her godson not react to it in a way that meant he had heard it very well. "She is reading her way through your library," the Countess added. "I know, she asked Pemberton about the engineering section yesterday." "Did she find what she was looking for?" "The Brunel chapter," he said. "Her father was an engineer." "I know," the Countess said. "He was a fine man. He died too young and left her with very little except his books, which she has carried in boxes from one posting to another since she was 23. She set down her teacup. "Did she tell you that?" "She told me he died before she could ask him the right questions." The Countess looked at her godson for a moment. "William," she said, which was the name she used when she was going to say something she meant him to hear carefully, "the last time you spoke to me about a woman for longer than the time required by politeness was at your mother's dinner table in 1879. Lady Elbourne, I am not suggesting anything. I am simply noting that it is 1887, and you have just spent 2 minutes talking to me about a woman you met 3 days ago, and I want you to be aware that this is happening because I have the impression you are not entirely aware that it is happening." The Duke was quiet. "She is your companion," he said. "Yes, she is also a person which I believe you have begun to notice." The Countess stood because she was finished, which was how she operated. She said the thing and then she was done with it. "I am going to write letters this morning. Do not feel you need to hide in your study." She left. The Duke sat at the breakfast table alone for another 6 minutes. Then he got up and went to the library. Clara was at the desk near the window when he came in, which was not the chair she had used the day before, because she had moved to the desk to have a surface to write on, and she had been there long enough to have arranged a small perimeter of papers and books around herself in the unconscious way of a person who has settled into a place. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He went to the far bookshelf, which was where he always went in the library, because it was where the estate records were kept in bound volumes by year, and he had legitimate business there every morning. He found the volume he wanted. He turned. "Did you find the Clifton chapter?" "Last night," she said. "I read half of it. He describes the towers in a way that makes you feel the wind." He was good at that. His notebooks are in the 3rd shelf from the top, 2nd section, if you want the technical drawings. Clara looked up from her papers. "You have Brunel's notebooks." "A reproduction set. My father bought them in 1862. He had no interest in engineering, but he bought anything that came up at the right auction for the right price." The faintest thing passed across his face that was too brief to name. The books outlasted most of his other investments. Clara got up from the desk before she had quite decided to. She went to the bookshelf he had indicated and found the reproductions, which were large and heavy and beautifully made, and she pulled one out and opened it on the library table and stood over it looking at the detailed pen drawings of cables and towers and load calculations with an expression that she was not trying to arrange into anything. "He would have wanted to see these," she said. It was a quiet thing to say. It was not said to the Duke particularly. It was the kind of thing that comes out when a person forgets to be careful for a moment. The Duke came and stood beside her at the table, not close enough to look at the same page. "What was his name?" he said. "George," she said. "George Whitmore. He built 3 railway bridges in the north of England and 1 in Wales, and he was never celebrated for any of them because the men who commissioned the bridges got the credit and the engineers got the fee." She turned the page carefully. "He didn't mind. He used to say that a bridge that stands doesn't need your name on it. That is a generous philosophy. He was a generous man." She turned another page. "These are the suspension calculations for the Clifton. Look at the margin notes." He looked. They stood at the table for 40 minutes going through the notebook page by page, and the Duke said things about structural engineering that suggested he knew more about it than most people without engineering training knew, which Clara noted without saying so. And Clara said things about her father's work that opened up slowly in the way of something that had been kept in a closed space for a long time and was being allowed carefully into the air. When they reached the final page of the volume, neither of them moved immediately. "He would have liked talking to you," Clara said. "You ask the right questions." It was a simple thing to say. She meant it simply. She did not notice the small silence that followed it because she was looking at the page. The Duke noticed the silence. He was not accustomed to being told that he asked the right questions. He was accustomed to being told that he was thorough, or exacting, or difficult to satisfy. These were things people said when they meant the same thing but did not want to say it directly. The right questions was not the same thing. The right questions meant that someone had been paying attention to the questions themselves and had made a judgment about their quality. "Thank you," he said. She looked up. For a moment they were standing at the same table looking at each other across a book of bridge drawings, and neither of them said anything. Then Clara closed the notebook carefully and set it on the shelf, and the Duke went back to his estate records, and they were each at their respective work for the rest of the morning, and Pemberton brought tea at 11 and noted privately that the Duke had moved his armchair 4 inches closer to the library table than it had been yesterday. He said nothing. He poured the tea. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at Aldermere House. His name was Geoffrey Harlow, and he was the Duke's cousin on his mother's side, which was a connection the Duke tolerated because the alternative was a family rift over something that had happened in 1863, and that he found increasingly difficult to recall with any precision. Geoffrey Harlow was 45 years old and prosperous, and the kind of man who wore his good opinion of himself so naturally that most people took it for granted before they had examined it carefully enough. He arrived at 3 o'clock, which was when Clara and the Countess were having tea in the sitting room off the main hall, and he came in while the Duke was still being told of his arrival, so the introductions were made in the sitting room doorway with the informal quality of things that had not been arranged. "Lady Elbourne," Geoffrey Harlow said, with a bow that communicated courtesy and the awareness of social position in exact proportion. "Mr. Harlow," the Countess said. "And this must be," he looked at Clara with an assessment that was performed quickly and not quite concealed. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Miss Clara Whitmore," the Duke said, arriving behind his cousin with the unhurried step of a man who has heard this kind of introduction made before. "Companion to Lady Elbourne." "Whitmore," Geoffrey said in the tone of a man consulting a mental filing system. "Whitmore, not the Devonshire Whitmores." "My family is from Bristol," Clara said. "Ah," he smiled in the way of a man who has filed and found nothing. "How delightful." He sat down and accepted tea, and talked with the easy fluency of a man who liked to talk and was used to people listening. He talked about the city, and about a horse he had bought, and about the weather, and about a political situation that he described as though he were personally involved in its resolution. The Countess listened with the expression of someone following a play they have seen before. Clara sat with her teacup and said very little, because there was very little asked of her. The Duke sat in the chair near the window and said even less. At one point Geoffrey Harlow turned to the Duke and said, with an air of casualness that was a degree too careful, "I had not known you were entertaining at present, William. A full house." "Lady Elbourne's townhouse is being painted," the Duke said. "Ugh. Convenient." He glanced at Clara with the brief sidelong attention of a man who is thinking something he is not going to say directly. "And Miss Whitmore has been here the whole week." "Since Monday," Clara said. "How charming." He set down his cup. "I believe I met a Whitmore once, in circumstances I won't detail in present company." He laughed in the way of a man who wants credit for exercising discretion without foregoing the advantage of the implication. The Countess's expression did not change. Clara's expression did not change. The Duke looked at his cousin for a moment. Geoffrey was already moving on to another topic, because he had made the implication and considered it complete, and he was not the kind of man who checked to see what it had done. Clara put down her teacup, with the small, particular sound of someone setting something down precisely. "If you will excuse me," she said, "I have letters to attend to." She left the room without hurrying. The Countess watched her go and then looked at the Duke. The Duke was looking at the empty doorway. "Will you be staying for dinner, Geoffrey?" the Duke said, in a voice that was perfectly even and perfectly pleasant, and that contained, if you knew him well enough to hear it, a quality of cold that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Geoffrey said he would be delighted. He did not notice the voice. The Countess had noticed it immediately. The dinner that evening was not unpleasant in any way that could be pointed to directly. There was good food and adequate conversation, and Geoffrey Harlow was on his best behavior, which was to say that he was entertaining in the effortless way of someone who has learned to perform charm without relying on its substance. Clara sat at the table and was pleasant and contributed to the conversation when it came her way, and did not give any sign that the afternoon had happened the way it had happened. The Duke watched this. He watched it and found that it did something particular to him, which was that it made him aware of the space between what he should have said in the sitting room and what he had in fact said, which was nothing. He had said nothing when Geoffrey made the implication, and Clara had excused herself, and the Countess had looked at him, and he had asked about dinner. He had said nothing. He had made a decision in the moment that it was better to keep the peace with his cousin than to correct an ambiguity about a woman who was his godmother's companion. He had made this decision with the quick, practical logic of a man who managed things, and it had seemed in the moment reasonable. He was finding, over dinner, that it felt less reasonable. After the meal, Geoffrey went to his club, and the Countess excused herself, and the Duke and Clara were briefly in the hall at the same time while Pemberton was fetching coats, and doing the various things Pemberton did at the end of an evening. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said. She looked at him. He had prepared something to say, in the way he had prepared the estate correspondence that morning, with precision and attention. He had intended to say that his cousin's remark had been entirely without foundation, and that he was sorry it had been said in this house. What he said was, "Geoffrey can be thoughtless." It was insufficient. He knew it was insufficient when he said it. Clara looked at him for a moment with the clear, direct look that she had, the one that saw what it was looking at. "Yes," she said, "he can." She thanked Pemberton for her coat and went upstairs. The Duke stood in the hall. He was a man who ran 3 estates and sat in the House of Lords, and had never in his adult life been uncertain about whether he had handled a situation correctly. He was uncertain now. He went to his study and did not read or write or do anything useful for 40 minutes. He sat in the chair by the fire and looked at the fire and thought about what the right thing to say had been in that sitting room, when his cousin had made his small, unpleasant implication, and Clara had set down her teacup and excused herself. The right thing had been to say, in the same casual tone Geoffrey had used, that he was afraid Geoffrey was thinking of someone else entirely, because Miss Whitmore had been in Lady Elbourne's service for 3 years, and was known to every household in which the Countess had a connection, which included most of the better houses in London. 2 sentences. He had not said them. Pemberton came in at 10:30 to bank the fire. "Pemberton," the Duke said. "Your Grace, I handled something poorly this afternoon." Pemberton banked the fire with the careful attention of a man who has been asked something in the form of a statement and is deciding how to receive it. "I would not know, Your Grace," he said. "No," the Duke said, "you would." Pemberton straightened. "Miss Whitmore conducted herself with considerable composure," he said, which was as far as he would go. "She did," the Duke said, "more composure than the situation required." "She is accustomed to composure being required," Pemberton said, and then stopped, because he had gone as far as he was prepared to go. The Duke nodded. "Good night, Pemberton." "Good night, Your Grace." Pemberton went out. The Duke sat by the banked fire for another 20 minutes. Then he went upstairs to the wrong room, remembered, went to the right one, and lay awake for a while thinking about the 2 sentences he should have said. Pemberton rose at 5:30 every morning as he had done for 30 years, first in his father's house where he had been a hall boy, then in 3 other houses of increasing distinction, and finally here in Aldermere House, which was the house he thought of as his in the way that devoted people think of the things they care for. Not owned, cared for, the distinction mattered to him. He dressed in the dark and went down to the kitchen while the house was still quiet, and he started the day in the methodical way he always did, which was to check the post, review the day's schedule, confirm the household inventory, and drink 1 cup of tea before anything else was required of him. On the 4th morning of the Countess's visit, he did all of these things and then sat at the kitchen table for an additional 5 minutes, which was unusual, because Pemberton was not a man who sat for longer than was required. He was thinking about what he had seen and what it meant, because he was, underneath the professional stillness, a person with a very precise mind and the habit of keeping accurate accounts. What he had seen over 4 days. The Duke had voluntarily given up his bedroom for a guest he did not know. This had never happened. The Duke had invited said guest to breakfast without prompting. In 19 years, the Duke had invited guests to breakfast 3 times, and all 3 had been members of Parliament with whom he had immediate business. The Duke had gone to the library, which he did not usually do during working hours, twice in the same day, and had on both occasions found Miss Whitmore already there, and on both occasions had stayed. The Duke had asked, with specific and casual-sounding interest, what Miss Whitmore took in her tea. He had not asked this about any guest before. He had not needed to, because he had never before cared whether a guest was comfortable in the way that you cared when you knew what someone preferred in their tea. The Duke had sat through a dinner at which his cousin made an implication, and had said nothing, and afterward had told Pemberton, which was the closest he ever came to admitting that he had made a mistake, that he had handled something poorly. And this morning, Pemberton had come down at 5:30 to find a folded note on the kitchen table, in the Duke's handwriting, which said simply that Pemberton was to arrange for Miss Whitmore's bag to be taken to the leather worker in Marylebone at the earliest opportunity, and that the work was to be charged to the household. Pemberton drank his tea. He had been a butler long enough to know that the way you could tell a household was about to change was not by the large events. Large events announced themselves. It was the small events that told you the truth. A question about tea, a note about a bag, a man sitting in his study for 40 minutes looking at a fire. He was not going to say anything to anyone about any of this. He was going to polish the good silver, as he had been doing since the first morning, and he was going to ensure that the household ran with its usual smoothness, and he was going to do his job. But he permitted himself, in the privacy of the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, one opinion. He thought it was about time. By the 4th evening, the house had settled into a rhythm that was not its usual rhythm, but had the quality of something that had found its own shape. The Countess wrote letters in the mornings and made calls in the afternoons, and was a very pleasant guest in the way of people who understand that being pleasant is one of the useful skills that everyone benefits from, and that takes more effort than it appears. Clara read and wrote and walked in the garden when the weather permitted, and continued to exist in the Duke's house with the same quality she had brought to his breakfast table on the first morning, which was that she did not perform herself for anyone's benefit, and therefore was entirely herself, which was something the Duke had noticed more than he had intended to. The Duke worked as he always worked, with the diligence of a man who believed that things went wrong when people were not paying attention, and who paid attention as a form of respect for the things he was responsible for. He had meetings and correspondence, and 2 afternoons of estate matters that required him to be on his own without distraction. But the evenings had changed. Before the Countess's arrival, the Duke ate dinner alone in the formal dining room or at his desk, depending on the demands of the day, and afterward read or dealt with papers and went to bed at a predictable time. The evenings were managed. They were efficient. They had the quality of a thing that is done correctly and without waste. Now the evenings had a fire in the sitting room and 3 people around it, and conversation that went in directions the Duke could not have predicted, which was a thing he had always found mildly uncomfortable when it was other people doing the predicting, and which he found, in this case, was not uncomfortable at all. The Countess told stories about people she had known, which were entertaining and occasionally improbable. Clara asked questions that took the stories in directions the Countess had not anticipated, which the Countess enjoyed enormously, because she liked anyone who was interesting enough to surprise her. The Duke mostly listened and said things when he had something to say, which was less often than either of the women, but tended to make the conversation change direction, not because he was being commanding, but because the things he said were worth considering. On the 4th evening, the Countess had gone to bed at 9, citing a letter she wanted to finish, and Clara and the Duke were alone in the sitting room for the first time, which had not been planned by either of them. Clara was reading, the Duke had papers he was supposed to be reviewing, the fire was going well. "You are not reading your papers," Clara said, without looking up from her book. The Duke looked at his papers. "No," he said. "Is it because they are dull, or because you are thinking about something else?" "Thinking about something else," he said, which was an honest answer he had not quite meant to give. "What?" He looked at the fire for a moment. "My cousin Geoffrey's remark yesterday," he said. Clara turned a page. "You do not need to think about that on my behalf," she said. "I handled it badly." "You handled it as most men in your position handle such things." She looked up, "which is to preserve the peace at the cost of the person who is least powerful in the room." It was not said in anger. It was said in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a thing they have observed many times and have made their peace with, which was somehow worse than anger. "That is accurate," he said. "Yes, I am sorry." She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that were doing something. "Thank you," she said. "That is the right thing to say now. I should have said something yesterday." "Yes, but you did not, and now you have said this, and that is the way things go." She closed her book on her thumb to hold the page. "I am not easily hurt by people like Geoffrey Harlow. I have met too many people like Geoffrey Harlow." "That is a depressing truth." "It is an ordinary truth. There is a difference." She opened her book again. "You are better than your cousin, your Grace. You know when you have done something wrong, which he will never manage." "That is not a high standard." "No, but it is a true one." She went back to reading. The Duke went back to not reading his papers. The fire went on being a good fire. After a while Clara said, without looking up, "The chapter on the 4th bridge is in the 2nd volume, if you were curious. I was not certain I should disturb the natural order of your reading." "You are not disturbing it. You are a reasonable person to have in a room." He was aware that she had said this in the same tone she used for everything, which was direct and without self-consciousness, and that it was one of the better things anyone had said to him in recent memory, not the most formally complimentary. Not the most strategically well-placed, just a true thing said simply. "Thank you," he said. "The 2nd volume is on the lower shelf, 3rd from the right." He got up and found it. He sat back down and he read and she read, and the fire went on burning, and neither of them said anything for a long time. On the 5th morning, the Duke knocked on the door of the Blue Room. This was not something he did. He did not knock on guest room doors. He sent Pemberton. He sent notes. He arranged things through the machinery of the household, which existed precisely so that people did not have to knock on each other's doors without warning. He knocked on the door of the Blue Room. Clara opened it. She was dressed and had been awake for some time, which was evident from the way she looked, which was fully present in the way of someone who had been up long enough to be thinking clearly. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He had not worked out on the way to the door exactly what he was going to say, which was also not something he did, and which told him something about the state of his planning. I wanted to ask whether you would like to walk this morning. There is a park 2 streets to the east. The trees are good in October. Clara looked at him. You are going for a walk, she said. I am going for a walk. To look at the trees. Among other things. There is a bridge in the park that has an interesting iron railing, if you find that relevant. She looked at him for a moment with the slight expression she had when she was deciding something. Give me 5 minutes, she said. The park was the kind of London park that was not famous but that people who lived near it were quietly grateful for. It had old trees that had been there since before the houses around it, and a path that curved along the edge of a small ornamental lake, and the iron bridge Clara had been promised, which was not grand but had the honest, pleasing look of a thing built by someone who understood what they were doing. Clara stood on the bridge and looked at the railing for longer than most people would have. The joints, she said. The rivet placement, the Duke said, who was standing beside her. It is different from the standard pattern. Who designed it? I have no idea. It is a park bridge in Marylebone. It is not documented anywhere I have been able to find. Someone cared about it, she said. You can see it in the work. They walked for an hour and a quarter. The conversation moved the way conversations do when two people have already done the work of finding out that they can speak honestly to each other and are now covering ground more freely. They talked about the bridges and then about his estates in Derbyshire, and then about what Clara had wanted to be before she became a companion, which was not a question he had planned to ask but which arrived naturally in the flow of things. A cartographer, she said. He looked at her. A cartographer, he said. I wanted to make maps. I was very good at the geometric work in school. My father encouraged it. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the path. Then he died and there was no money for study and the Countess needed a companion and I was good at that too, so that is what I am. Do you mind it? Sometimes, she said with the honesty of a person who does not perform contentment, not the work itself. I am fond of Lady Elbourne and the work is interesting most of the time. I mind she thought about it, the narrowness of the space, the way that being useful to someone else does not leave very much room for being useful to yourself. He was quiet for a moment. I have never had that problem, he said. No, you have the opposite problem. He looked at her. The space is all yours, she said. The estates, the house, the work, the evenings, all arranged for you, no one else's needs in the way. She glanced at him. I imagine it gets very quiet. He walked for a few steps without answering. It does, he said. They had come back around to the bridge. Clara stopped and looked at it again from the other side, which gave a different view of the iron joints. If I had made maps, she said, I would have wanted to make the ones that showed the structures, not the borders and the rivers, the way things hold together. That is a different kind of map. Yes, the kind most people do not think they need until they are lost. She turned from the bridge and started back toward the gate. He walked beside her, and the park was doing what October parks do, which is showing you everything that is about to go and making it look its best while it is going, and neither of them said anything for the last 5 minutes of the walk, and neither of them needed to. The Countess found the Duke in his study at midday. She did not knock because she never knocked, because she had known him since he was 8 years old, and considered knocking a formality that did not apply between people with 30 years of history. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was also a formality she had long since set aside. She is going to leave on Friday, the Countess said. The Duke set down his pen. I am aware, he said. You are both expected at the Hammersley dinner on Saturday. Yes, the Countess folded her hands in her lap with the air of a woman settling in for a conversation of some duration. I want to ask you something directly, William, because I find that at my age, indirection costs time I no longer wish to spend. He waited. What is it that you intend? She said. He looked at her. He picked up his pen and then set it down again, which was the gesture of a man who is not avoiding the question, but is being exact about the answer. I do not know yet, he said. That is honest. You asked for honesty. I did, she looked at him steadily. She is not a woman who can be offered something ambiguous, William. She has built her life in small, careful spaces with what was given to her, and she has done it with dignity, and she will not be patient with a man who takes his time at her expense. I understand that. Do you understand it, or do you understand it? He looked at her in the measured way. Both, he said. She stood up. She straightened her skirts in the way she had when she had finished with a thing. Friday, she said, is not very far away. She went to the door. Lady Elbourne, he said. She stopped. Does she know what I think of her? The Countess turned. She looked at him with the particular expression she had saved over 30 years, for the moments when he was being his most himself, which was to say clear and direct and slightly belated. No, she said, she thinks you are civil and that you ask the right questions. She has said that you are a reasonable person to have in a room, which from Clara is not a small thing. That is not what I mean. I know what you mean. She looked at him for a moment. No, she does not know. She left. The Duke sat at his desk. He looked at the clock. It was Thursday. Thursday morning arrived with the decisive quality of a day that knew it was the second to last of something. Clara was aware of it. She was aware in the way of someone who had learned, over years of living in other people's houses, to track time carefully, because the end of things came faster than expected, and it was better to be ready for them than to be caught unprepared. She had packed half her things the night before, not out of sadness, or not only out of sadness, out of the practical awareness that tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not, and that being ready was the thing she had control over. She went down to breakfast. The Duke was already there. He looked at her when she came in with the particular quality of attention he had that was so different from other people's looking, which was that it was not social or performative but simply what it was, which was a man paying attention. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She sat down. Pemberton poured her coffee. "Is the Countess up?" "Not yet. She said last night she intended to sleep until 8. Clara accepted her coffee. She looked at the window, where the October morning was doing its thing of being cold and precise and faintly golden, the way of mornings that do not apologize for being beautiful. "I thought we might go out again this morning," the Duke said, "if you wanted." She looked at him. "It is the last full day," he said, in the voice of a man stating a fact. "Yes. There is a street near the river that has a row of warehouses built in 1840 with visible iron framing. I thought you might find them interesting." "Iron framing," she said. "Early structural ironwork. The kind your father would have." He stopped. "I thought you might like to see them." Clara looked at her coffee. She had spent 4 years as a companion, and before that 2 years managing a difficult household for an aunt who had not paid her properly, and before that 5 years at home in Bristol watching her father's health fail with the slow determination of something that cannot be hurried or helped. In all of that time she had built very good walls, not out of coldness, but out of the intelligent understanding of someone who had too much to lose to be careless with it. She was aware this morning that the walls were not where she had left them. "I would like that," she said. He nodded. They ate. The street near the river was narrow and not particularly fashionable, and it smelled of the river and the industry that lived along it, which was not romantic in any conventional sense, but had the specific quality of a place that was exactly what it was, and made no effort to be anything else. The warehouses were as the Duke had described, large, brick-faced, with the structural ironwork visible at the corners and along the upper frames, built in a period when people were still working out how iron and brick could be made to work together. Clara stood in the street and looked at them. She walked the length of the row slowly. She looked at the joints and the load-bearing arrangements and the places where you could see the builder's decisions in the finished work, which was the thing about old structures that she found most moving, which was the evidence of thinking frozen into stone and iron. The Duke walked beside her and said things when things needed saying and was quiet when quiet was better, and this was something she had noticed about him over 5 days that was not nothing, which was that he understood the difference between the two. "There," she said, stopping in front of the third warehouse. She pointed at a corner junction. "That is unusual, the angle of the bracket." "I noticed that as well. It distributes the load differently. Less vertical stress on the foundation. More lateral bracing." "Yes," she looked at it for a long moment. Someone worked that out on paper first and then built it. You can see where they were uncertain in the early sections and where they committed to the solution. Where? She pointed. He looked. The third bay, he said. The spacing changes. They were learning as they went, and then they knew. She dropped her hand and stood looking at the building with the expression she had when she was inside a problem. I used to think, she said, that the best thing about bridges was that they went somewhere. They connected two things that had no connection. That was what my father loved about them. She paused. But I think now the better thing is that they hold. That they are tested and they hold. The Duke was looking at her. Miss Whitmore, he said. She turned. He was standing on the uneven street outside a row of warehouses in the cold October morning, and he was not a man who spoke without preparation, but he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone who has decided something and is not afraid of it. I am going to say something, he said. I want to say it here, not in the house, because the house belongs to my title and my position, and the conversation I want to have does not belong to any of that. She waited. I have spent 5 days discovering that you are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, he said. That your company is something I will notice the absence of acutely. That I have been better at my work, and better at being in a room, and better in some way I cannot fully specify since you arrived in my house, and went to sleep in my bedroom without asking anyone's permission. Clara looked at him. I am also aware, he said, that I did not handle Jeffrey's remark correctly, and that I am asking you to trust the quality of my attention when I have given you one clear example of its failure, and that this is a thing you have every right to weigh. Yes, she said. I am asking you to weigh it anyway, against the 5 days. She was quiet for a long moment. On the street around them, London went on being London, which was to say busy and indifferent and full of its own concerns. What are you asking me? She said. I am asking whether there is any possibility, he said, that you might be persuaded to stay, not as Lady Elbourne's companion, as something else entirely. As he stopped. He had prepared this part and had lost it. I am asking whether you would consider a future that was wider than the one you currently have. You are asking me that on a street. I am asking you wherever you happen to be, because I am not prepared to wait until I have found the correct chair and the correct words and the correct. I am not prepared to wait. Clara looked at him. She looked at him with the direct, clear look that saw what it was looking at, and what it was looking at was a man who was used to managing things, and had not managed this, and was standing in the cold outside a warehouse being honest about it, which was not a small thing. You moved very fast, she said. Yes, 5 days is not a long acquaintance. No, it is not. I do not know what my answer is yet, she said. He was quiet. That is not a no, she said. He looked at her. I need to think, she said, and I need you to understand that thinking is not the same as hesitation. I am a careful person. I have been careful for 20 years. I am not going to stop being careful because you stood me in front of a warehouse and said something honest. I understand that. I will think, she said, until tomorrow. He nodded. They walked back to the house. And if the walk was different from the walk out, which it was, neither of them described the difference. That evening was the last full evening, and the Countess made it pleasant in the way she was capable of making things pleasant, which was by being completely herself and trusting that this was sufficient. She told a story about an ambassador she had known in Vienna that was funnier the second time she told it, which was something of a trick. She made the Duke tell a story about Derbyshire in winter that Clara had not heard, and it was the kind of story you would not have expected from a man who communicated in complete sentences and looked at rooms for structural soundness, which was to say it was funny and precise and slightly self-deprecating in a way he probably did not know it was. Clara sat in the sitting-room chair she had made her own over the week, and listened and said things when things came to her, and watched the fire and felt the evening the way you feel things that are closing. She had made her decision by 8:30, but she did not announce it, because the evening was good, and she did not want to interrupt it with anything that would make everyone behave differently toward the end of it. At 10 o'clock the Countess went to bed. At 10 past, Clara stood and said she was going to do the same. The Duke stood. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She was at the door. She turned. "I thought about it," she said. He waited. "I have been a companion for 3 years and a general sort of useful person for a great many years before that," she said. "And in all of that time I have been very careful about what I let myself want, because wanting things that are too large is a quick way to make yourself miserable when you have very little control over whether you get them." "Yes," he said. "You are a large thing to want," she said. He said nothing. "But I am tired," she said, "of only wanting small things." She held his look for a moment. "My answer is not no." "It is not no," he said. "I need you to ask me properly, when you have arranged for the correct chair and the correct words." She almost smiled. "I will wait for the correct chair." "I will arrange it for breakfast," he said. "I thought you might." She went to bed. She lay awake for a while in the blue room that she had come to know the shape of over 5 days, with the flowered rug and the painting of the sea above the mantel. And she thought about the street near the river and the warehouse with the unusual bracket, and the man who had chosen to say what he meant in a cold street rather than wait for a better setting. She thought it was the right choice. Not his choice, hers. She had been making choices in narrow spaces for a long time. This was a wider space, and it was terrifying, and it was the right one, and she was going to sleep now, and tomorrow was breakfast. Friday arrived. The morning was clear in the way of late October days that have decided to be generous about it, as though compensating for the month's general austerity. The light came through the windows of Aldermere House at an angle that made everything look its best, the way certain lights are honest about the quality of things rather than flattering about their surface. Clara came downstairs at 7:30. She had packed her bag completely, with the repaired strap that now held with the confidence of leather that had been properly attended to. She had left the bridge engineering book on the desk in the blue room with a note that said only, "Found the Clifton chapter. Thank you." She had written to her sister in Bristol with the care of someone writing a letter they were not entirely sure how to explain. The breakfast room. The Duke was standing by the window when she came in, which was unusual. He was not at the table with his papers and his coffee in the correct places. He was at the window, and he turned when she came in, and he was holding a small notebook. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He set the notebook on the table. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "I wrote it down," he said. "The correct words. I have always managed things better in writing." She sat down. Pemberton appeared, poured coffee, and withdrew with the smoothness of a man who was not going to be present for this particular part of the morning. "There is no correct chair," the Duke said. "I realized that last night. The chair question was a distraction." "Yes, but the words." He opened the notebook. He did not read from it. He looked at it for a moment and then closed it, because it turned out the words were already in the right order. "You said I moved fast," he said. "You did. I have been fast about nothing in my life before this week," he said. "I have managed and planned and arranged and been thorough, and I have been alone, which I have called efficient and which is, I understand now, a word I have been using to mean something else." He looked at her directly in the way he did everything. "I want to ask you to marry me, not because 5 days is a long acquaintance, because it is not. Because in 5 days I have learned that I have been looking for this without knowing what I was looking for, and I am not willing to let it leave on the 8 o'clock to Edinburgh and spend the next year being thorough about something that is not this." Clara set down her coffee cup. She looked at him. "You said ask me properly," he said. "That is the proper version." "That is the proper version," she agreed. "It is not a long speech." "No, it is the right length." She picked up her coffee cup again. She looked at the window, where the October morning was being generous. She thought about the warehouse bracket and the park bridge and the library at 2 in the afternoon, and the notebook on the table that had the words written down in case he lost them, which was the kind of thing a careful and honest man did, which was the kind of man she had been waiting for without exactly knowing she was waiting. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, which was how she said everything that mattered. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pemberton." Pemberton, who had been approximately 4 feet from the breakfast room door, appeared with the timing of a man who had been ready. "Your Grace," he said. We will need the good china this morning. Pemberton permitted himself a look that was not quite an expression and was entirely a feeling. Of course, Your Grace, he said. Congratulations. He went to get the good china, which he had quietly moved to the top shelf 3 days ago, because he had been keeping accurate accounts. The Countess of Elborn was informed at 8 o'clock, in the hall, with her coat already on and her bag already packed and her carriage already called. She stood perfectly still for a moment, and then she did something that neither the Duke nor Clara had ever seen her do, which was that she did not say anything at all for a full 10 seconds. Then she took Clara's face in both hands and looked at her the way she had looked at her for 3 years, which was with the warm, exact attention of someone who saw what they were looking at. Good, she said. She turned to the Duke. Your father, she said, would have been very slow about this. I know, he said. Your mother would have been very pleased. I know that too. She let go of Clara's face, she straightened her coat. I will need a new companion, she said, to no one in particular. Clara, you will help me find one. Of course, Clara said. Someone with more patience than you for my filing. Anyone would have more patience than me for your filing. True, the Countess moved toward the door where Pemberton was holding it. She stopped. William. Lady Elborn. The portmanteau, she said, looking at Clara's bag by the door. Do not let her take it to Edinburgh. He looked at her. She doesn't need to go to Edinburgh, the Countess said. Her things can be sent. She looked at Clara with the bright, slightly imperious look of a woman who had managed things for 60 years and did not intend to stop. Stay. Clara looked at her employer for a long moment. 3 years, Edinburgh and London, and the archive of the late Earl's letters, and the filing that she was impatient about, and the train journeys and the dinner parties where she sat behind the Countess's shoulder, and the nights in houses that were not hers. I will write you a very long letter, Clara said. You will write me a very short letter, the Countess said. You always use too many words when you are being sentimental. She went out the door. Her carriage pulled away. Clara stood in the hall of Aldermere House with her repaired bag, and the clear October morning coming through the open door, and the Duke beside her. She looked at the bag. She looked at the door. She set the bag down. Not against the wall where things were set temporarily, in the middle of the floor where things were set when they were staying. The blue room is very comfortable, she said. You can have any room in the house, he said. I like the blue room, it has a good painting. It has a painting of the sea, he said. It was my mother's choice. She said a house needed at least one room that looked somewhere beyond itself. Clara looked at him. She was right, she said. Pemberton appeared and took the bag, which he had been prepared to do for some time. And the portmanteau stayed in the hall of Aldermere House, not against the wall, not by the door, but simply there, in the place where it had been set by a woman who had spent 20 years moving through other people's houses with care, and had found in 5 days in October the house that was going to keep her. She would tell her sister in Bristol. She would write a letter that was, despite what the Countess said, exactly as long as it needed to be. And the house, which was old and well-made and had held against everything it had been asked to hold against, held this too, without difficulty, the way good structures hold the things that are given to them. The way bridges hold. The way things built by people who understood their work hold, long after the names of the builders have been forgotten, long after the credit has gone to other people, long after all of it. They hold because someone cared enough to build them right. And that is enough. That has always been enough.